In this episode, we get into the history of the land of Israel and many conflicts surrounding them and their Arab neighbours, as well as correcting some propaganda and misinformation. It's going to be a long one, so get a cushion for your chair if need be, and enjoy. I'm Jason, and this is the Aussie Berean. Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Aussie Berean. Now, this episode is a topic that I think needs to be discussed as much within Christianity as well as in the rest of the world. It seems that a lot of Christianity doesn't quite know why we support Israel in the current conflict over Palestine, and it seems a lot of the Western world doesn't really understand what they're supporting Palestine for. Now, as Christians, we know the land is promised to Israel. So many Christians support them by default, but when questioned by pro-Palestinian supporters, it seems Christians cannot adequately defend their position, especially when claims about the past are made. Our politicians also fall short with the history behind these two groups, which is evident by the policies and comments regularly made by them that we see and we hear in our local news. Now, this episode, guys, is 13,000 words long, so it's going to be a long one. It's going to be quite a bit longer than most episodes. But with the free tools that I'm using online to edit these episodes, I only have a 2-hour limit, so I can guarantee it's going to be less than 2 hours. Myself, I've always held a stance against politics mixing with Christianity, which is why I've never really done anything on Christmas or Easter or even Halloween. But after the events surrounding Charlie Kirk's death, and a few conversations that I've had since that time, I've softened a little bit in the sense that I will most likely be tackling some political discussions, but from a biblical point of view in future episodes. Now, I'm not looking to promote Christian nationalism because I don't agree with it right from its core to the edges. Neither am I intending to promote a theocratic government type position either, because quite frankly, Christians should not be political leaders. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe there should be Christian parties in politics to provide the current powers with godly counsel and to be the voice of reason. I mean, Daniel was a politician in Babylon, right? So he was such a good one that he stayed there under the Persians and then the Greeks as well. Esther is another one, as well as Elijah, who can be considered to play politics, and there's many more in Scripture. But I just believe that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and every example of a theocracy at its core is one person's interpretation of scriptural commandments, and it never really works. It just ends up getting exploited. So let's start at the very beginning. Okay, whose land is it? Now, I did toss up whether to start in our day and work backwards on this episode, but I've decided to start from the beginning. Now, the Bible is not just our scriptures and God's word to humanity, but it's also a historical book with accurately recorded history, and so accurate, in fact, that archaeology uses it to work out places to dig to find ancient ruins. But if we go right back all the way to Abraham, God promised him a land for his offspring that was later partly fulfilled through the conquests of Canaan through Joshua after the death of Moses. However, it was never really completely fulfilled. Now, the land area that was promised to Abraham's descendants can be found in Genesis 15:18, which says, "In the same day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, Unto your seed I have given this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." So as far west as the Nile River, I believe, to the river Euphrates in the east. So that's Egypt to modern-day Iraq, basically would split modern-day Iraq in half. And then we go to Deuteronomy 11:24, and it says, "Every place whereon the soles of your feet shall tread shall be yours, from the wilderness and Lebanon, from the river Euphrates, even to the uttermost sea shall your coast be." And then that's repeated in Joshua 1:4. It says, "From the wilderness and this Lebanon, even unto the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites, and unto the great sea towards the going down of the sun shall be your coast." Now we know that the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. So going down of the sun is a reference to the western border. Now, from the information I can find about the historical land names and borders, it appears to be as far north as the mountains of Lebanon to the Red Sea in the south. Now, and then the last place for a complete border outline is in Numbers 34, and that's verses 3 to 12. It's quite a long portion. It says, "Then your south quarter shall be from the wilderness of Zin, along by the coast of Edom, and your south border shall be the outmost coast of the Salt Sea eastward. And your border shall turn from the south to the ascent of Akrabim, and pass on to Zin. And the going forth thereof shall be from the south to Kadesh Barnea, and shall go on to Hazar Adar, and pass on to Asmon. And the border shall fetch a compass from Asmon unto the river of Egypt, and the goings out of it shall be at the sea. And as for the western border, you shall even have the great sea for a border. This shall be your west border. And this shall be your north border. From the great sea you shall point out for you Mount Hor. From Mount Hor you shall point out your border unto the entrance of Hamath. And the goings forth of the border shall be to Zedad. And the border shall go to Ziphron, and the goings out of it shall be at Hazar Enan. This shall be your north border. And you shall point out your east border from Hazar Enan to Shepham. And the coast shall go down from Shepham to Riblah on the east side of Ain, and the border shall descend, and shall reach unto the side of the sea from Chinnereth eastward. And the border shall go down to Jordan, and the goings out of it shall be at the Salt Sea. This shall be your land with the coasts thereof round abouts." Now, I'll link a map in the show notes, but basically it's a lot more than what they have now. Now, you may have heard the phrase chanted recently, "from the river to the sea," which is chanted by many pro-Palestinian activist groups in the West, which calls for a single state between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. But what's actually being called for is Israel to be vacated from here and Palestine to stay. But this is fighting against God's will and his plan for Israel. Israel will one day take possession of this land because God has promised it. Now, our Bibles record this promise, okay? And the Quran also recognizes the land as Israel's, despite the Arab world calling for it to be Palestine. So in Surah 5:20 to 21 of the Quran, it says this. It says, "Remember when Moses said to his people, 'O my people, remember Allah's favors upon you, when he raised prophets from among you, made you sovereign, and gave you what he had never given anyone in the world. O my people, enter the holy land which Allah has destined for you to enter, and do not turn back, or else you will become losers.'" So this is Moses saying to his people. He didn't say to the Arabs. Moses was saying this to the Hebrews because Moses' people were the Hebrews. He took them out of Egypt and they went through the Red Sea and they got to the other side. Moses' people were the Hebrews. Then in Surah 17, verse 104, it talks about how the land was given to Israel, which are the people of Moses. Surah 17, verse 104, it says, "And we said to the children of Israel," not the children of Palestine, but the children of Israel, "after Pharaoh, reside in the land, but when the promise of the hereafter comes to pass, we will bring you all together." Now, all followers of the Quran disobey their own book when they call for Israel to be called out of their land. So after this promise, the land was conquered bit by bit through Joshua's campaigns. The land was originally called Canaan, and then it became Israel, or Judea. Now, reading through the books of Kings and Chronicles, Israel became divided against itself in around 931 BC, with the northern kingdom being called Israel and the southern kingdom being called Judah. Over time, that's when the land became known as Judea. Now, the northern kingdom was conquered by the Assyrians in 722 BC, and the southern kingdom was conquered by Babylon in 586 BC under the rule of King Nebuchadnezzar. When the Medes and Persians conquered Babylon around 538 BC, the Israelites were allowed to return to the land to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem under the reign and the order of Cyrus the Great, 20 years later, around 516 BC. Now, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah both record the decree and the building process of the walls of Jerusalem. After this, Alexander the Great of the Greek Empire conquered the land once again, which was foretold in the book of Daniel, in which the majority of the known world was given to his rule. The land here was still known as Judea and is never, ever recorded as Palestine in either the Bible or the Quran, or even in any secular writings. It's always been called either Israel or Judea. Now, when Rome started conquering the Greek rule from Antiochus Epiphanes in 146 BC, the land was still called Judea, which is written on maps from the time period. And I've actually linked a map showing the land that was still being called Judea in 117 AD. Now, an excerpt from page 72 of the complete works of Flavius Josephus records who was appointed procurator over this land. And it says, when Caesar heard this, he declared Hyrcanus to be the most worthy of the high priesthood and gave leave to Antipater to choose what authority he pleased. But he left the determination of such dignity to him that bestowed the dignity upon him. So he was constituted procurator of all Judea and obtained leave, moreover, to rebuild those walls of his country that had been thrown down. Being that it's recorded Antipater was procurator of Judea, we can firmly say that the land from the time when the Israelites conquered Canaan all the way until Rome was called Judea or Israel, with Jerusalem as its capital. It wasn't until the Jewish revolt of 132 to 136 AD, which is also known as the Bar Kokhba revolt, that the name of the land was changed to Syria Palestina by Emperor Hadrian, who also expelled a great deal of the Jews that lived there. The land wasn't given to another people group, and another ethnicity wasn't formed. The name of the region was just simply changed. So every person that was born in this land hereafter was not called Palestinian, because Palestinian is not an ethnicity. Now, after Rome came the Byzantine Empire, after the fall of Emperor Constantine around 324 AD, and was taken over briefly by the Sasanian Empire in 614 AD, before being recaptured by the Byzantines in 629 AD, until the Rashidun Caliphate captured it in 637 AD. Now, this was the first Islamic empire, and it lasted until 661 AD. Now, at this time, Muhammad had died, and the Quran was in circulation, which I again want to point out that the land, according to the Quran, was promised to the Jews by God, or the Hebrews. And the word Palestine is never mentioned in the Quran, and it's not even in the original Aramaic. Only Israel was ever mentioned. Now then we enter the Crusades, starting in the 11th century AD. So it's 1095 AD, where Christians decided to rid the land of the Muslims, who themselves had heavily persecuted the Jews and the Christians of the area. In some cases, whole tribes and groups of Christians and Jews were killed under the convert or die policy of the Muslim occupation in the land. The mostly French army of the First Crusade conquered Jerusalem from the Seljuks in 1099 and expanded the territory that they held in the following years. According to Illenblum, the Franks tended to settle in the southern half of the region between Jerusalem and Nablus, since there was a sizable Christian population there. Now, I want to state for the record that I don't believe many of the people who took part in the Crusades were truly Christian. While the first and possibly the second crusade were full of devout Christian men, like many historians, I also believe that their success attracted men looking to exploit the situation for the spoils of war in the later crusades. To simplify it, I believe that the first and maybe second crusade were legitimate. They were Christians, they had the right heart, they wanted to go in and save the people. But other people after that who just simply wanted to kill came and joined the crusades because it gave them an opportunity to do that. So the third, fourth, fifth, sixth, and all those other crusades, I think, do not represent Christianity at all. Okay, I don't think they represent Christianity in the slightest. Now, I don't agree with the bulk of what was done in the Crusades, and like I said, I wouldn't really call them Christian campaigns, and it is unfortunately a part of our own history, no matter how misguided it was. Now, after them came the Ottoman Empire in the 13th century, who conquered the land once again, and its most notable conquest was the conquering of Constantinople in 1453 AD. By 1699, it started to lose territory from costly wars, internal stagnation, and revolts. But it wasn't until 1922, during World War I, that the Ottoman Empire officially ended when it was dissolved. The League of Nations mandate gave Great Britain control of the land of Judea, now known as Palestine, and Great Britain began to bring displaced Jews back to their land. But Arab efforts to stop the migration and the constant violence from the Arabs towards the Jews caused Great Britain to terminate the mandate in 1947 and completely withdraw from the land. Now, the ethnic Jews have been there ever since, right up until today. And so this is the history of the land. So why are the Arabs and the ethnic Jews at war today? Why is there no peace and no sign of any peace coming? Now, this is another long and drawn-out discussion, so let's get right into it just for the sake of time, because I know that the clock's going to be against us on this episode. Now, it starts in the early 1900s, where Britain started to bring ethnic Jews back into the land. The article I linked from Britannica says this. I actually linked about 7 or 8 different articles from Britannica. Like, there's a lot in the show notes, guys. Like, the show notes is going to be like really, really rich with information. But it says this, it says, both Jewish and Palestinian expectations for an independent state in historical Palestine can be traced to World War I, as the United Kingdom attempted to shore up support against the Ottoman Empire and the Central Powers. The Hussein-McMahon Correspondence of 1915 to 1916 promised British support for Arab independence in exchange for Arab support against the Ottoman Empire. Though the correspondence discussed the extent of territory under Arab rule, historical Palestine, which was not located along the disputed edges and whose population was predominantly Arab, was not explicitly discussed, and it was assumed to be included in the agreement by Hussein ibn Ali, the Emir of Mecca, and his supporters. I don't know how to pronounce that name. The following year, the Balfour Declaration promised British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. And then it says, over the following decades, waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine led to a significant increase in the Jewish population. The rapid immigration rate, which was managed by the United Kingdom, was met with protests from the Arab population. In 1947, as the United Kingdom prepared to withdraw from the region, the United Nations passed a partition plan known as UN Resolution 181 that would divide Palestine into a Jewish state and an Arab state, an idea originally proposed by the British government about a decade earlier. The partition plan was rejected by the Arabs, and the ensuing conflict over territory led to the First Arab-Israeli War of 1948 to 49. The two-state solution proposed by the Oslo Accords was born out of a series of historical events. After the fall of the Ottoman Empire, Jews and Arabs both claimed the right to self-determination in historical Palestine. A first attempt at partitioning the land in 1948 resulted in an Israeli state but no Palestinian state, and the West Bank and Gaza Strip fell under Jordanian and Egyptian rule respectively. Now, even though this article calls the land historical Palestine, we need to remember that this was the name that Rome gave the land. The ethnic Jews were driven out of the land, and the people who are there now are Arab, not Palestinian. Palestine is not an ethnicity. Now, in May 1948, it's when Israel declared its independence as a state after the British withdrawal, and the United Nations offered a two-state solution called the Oslo Accords in an attempt to bring peace in the land, in which this two-state solution would divide the land between the Arabs and the Jews, giving the Arabs a substantially large portion of the area previously owned by Britain, in which Israel accepted straight away, but the Arabs refused. Instead, Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip and Jordan ruled the West Bank. So this is where all of the modern day conflicts and wars and conspiracy theories and propaganda all start from. And most likely where interest might be sparked in most people. But before we get into any of that, we need to comprehend the history we just went through and put some logic into the mix, okay? So the land originally belonged to the Canaanites. The Israelites conquered the land under the commandment of God, which will only hold weight to the Christian and Jewish and Islamic perspectives. But the Israelites lived in this land for thousands of years, through many conquerings, and the land was known as Judea, with the Israelites, who are ethnic Jews, being the people of the land. The land's name was changed to Syria Palestine, or Syria Palestina, which was an intentional slur to the Jewish revolt designed to relate the land to the Israelite enemy, the Philistines. It wasn't until the 7th century that there was any Muslim or Arab presence in the land, who, when they came, not only slaughtered the religious Jews, but also the Jewish Christians of the land, which is what sparked the Crusades. The land was then conquered by different empires over time, but ethnic Jews were still the population. So technically, even though the land name has changed, a true Palestinian is an ethnic Jew. Now, I'm sure there are many people who would disagree with that, and they'll argue, and probably some who will yell at me or yell at the episode. But history is history, and whether someone conquered the land afterwards or not does not make them native or indigenous to the land. The Arabs who took over the area prior to 1948, technically speaking, are the occupiers, which is the very thing that today's ethnic Jews are being accused of. However, we also have another technicality here too, because many of the ethnic Arabs that live there today are also born in this land and also belong there. So for example, if somebody from China came to Australia 70 years ago and had children, who had children, who had children, they have as much right to be here as any Caucasian or Aboriginal Australian who was born here as well. Now that itself might bring its own arguments and pushback, and despite the historical mistreatment of any nation's people, and I'm pretty sure you who are listening, did not have any part in that. But aside from that, the ethnic Jews who are in the land today, they all know this as well, and they accept this, and they're willing to live side by side with the Arabs living in the region today, despite all the propaganda you might hear in the media. Now, it is in fact the Arabs in the neighboring territories who do not want to live with the Jews near them, but the Palestinian Arabs live peacefully with the Jews today inside of Israel. And we know this by the population numbers. Now, I've linked a website from the Minority Rights Group website, which is, it's not free of propaganda, but here is what it says. It says approximately 1.8 million Palestinians form around 21% of Israel's population. However, their population is growing faster than the population as a whole. Though the majority are Muslim, there are also a sizable minority of Palestinian Christians as well as Druze. While some surveys have suggested that the majority of Palestinian Israelis identify positively with Israel, many feel excluded because of its identity as a Jewish state. Many remain segregated from the Jewish majority, with most concentrated in Palestinian majority towns that are among the poorest and more marginalized areas in Israel. Now, the article says the majority of Palestinian Israelis are happy in Israel, but it then throws an emphasis on the smaller portion that lives in poorer areas. Now, in my country, in Australia, every ethnicity has a rich area and a poor area. They have rich people and poor people among them. They aren't poor because they're being oppressed by the Australian government. There's as many Caucasians or white people in the poverty line as there are any other nationality. The same is in Israel. But look at the numbers, okay? So 1.6 million Arab Palestinians making up 20% of the population. How many ethnic Jews are living in the neighboring territories. In Jordan, there's 0. In Yemen, there's less than 50. In Lebanon, there's around about 29 to 30. In Saudi Arabia, there's about 2,000 to 3,000. In Iraq, there's about 4 or 5. Okay, and these numbers are all available on various websites by Googling how many Jews live in country XXX today. Now, before we get into the wars and the conflicts, have a pause and think about this question for me. If Israel's goal was to cause the genocide of Palestinian people, as is the claim of today, would they have allowed or still have 20% of their population to be Palestinian? Would they not have just eradicated them from the earth already, much like the Arab countries have done to the ethnic Jews that once lived with them? So ask yourself that question for a minute and think about it. Now let's go to where the modern day wars began. And that's around the 1948 period. But it actually began just a little bit prior. I'm also going to address a few conspiracy theorist arguments as we go on too. So while Britain controlled the area of Judea, now called Palestine, they started to invite Jews from all over the world to return to Jerusalem after World War II. Among these ethnic Jews are what's known as Ashkenazi Jews, who were Jews who had been forced out of their land during the rise of Islam and the Ottoman Empire. So these are European Jews, okay, specifically from Germany, Poland, and those surrounding areas. Now, as they started returning to their land, they started growing exponentially in population, and the Arabs of the area started getting restless. So firstly, I want to address the term Ashkenazi Jew, because today there is a lot of people who call themselves Christian who will say that Ashkenazi Jew is not a real Jew, but a Caucasian conspiracy to take over the land of Israel. They will say things like they are the synagogue of Satan, spoken of in Revelation, and they'll appeal to one of Japheth's grandsons, Ashkenaz, as their origin, instead of Heber, from where the Hebrews came from. Now, the scriptures for Noah's descendants, because to get into this argument, I have to go through the history of it. Like, it's not avoidable. But the scriptures for Noah's descendants is in Genesis 10. It says, chapter 10, verse 2 to 5. It says, the sons of Japheth were Gomer and Magog, and Madai and Javan, and Tubal and Meshech and Tyrus. And the sons of Gomer was Ashkenaz and Riphath and Togarmah. And the sons of Javan were Elisha and Tarshish and Kittim and Dodanim. By these were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, everyone after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Now, being called Ashkenazi has absolutely nothing to do with Japheth's grandson Ashkenaz, other than the fact that Ashkenaz founded the German area. And so ethnic Jews that come from Germany and the surrounding areas like Poland and all those areas, etc., are dubbed Ashkenazi, not because they came from a Gentile line or because they came from Ashkenaz's line, but because they were born in the region that Ashkenaz founded. Now, in the same fashion, an ethnic Jew from the Middle Eastern Arab nations are called Mizrahi Jews because of the region that they came from. It's the same for the Sephardic Jews, which came from the Iberian Peninsula, most commonly in Spain. Now, as for the reference to the synagogue of Satan, this comes from Revelation chapter 2. Verses 8 to 10 says, to the angel of the church in Smyrna, write these things says the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know your works and tribulation and poverty, but you are rich, and I know the blasphemy of them which say that they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of these things which you shall suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and you shall have tribulation 10 days. Be you faithful unto death, and I will give you a crown of life. So firstly, you only come to that conclusion if Ashkenazi Jews are not real Jews. And we've just shown that they are. So I don't really need to explain this away any further than just to say that if you are a conspiracy theorist and you're a replacement theologian, you are grievously wrong. It's as simple as that. Secondly, if Hitler considered these Ashkenazis as real Jews, and rounded them up to be sent to the gas chambers, why do we not consider them ethnic Jews today? It's not rocket science, okay? If you've been peddling this nonsense, it's time to repent. So let's get further into it now. So in 1948, Great Britain withdraws from the region, and what's the first thing that happens? The moment that Great Britain leaves, bang, Israel is attacked. An excerpt from the Britannica article, and look guys, there is going to be a ton of things that I quote from articles because I do this in order to keep me honest so that I don't just blurt out and speak my own mind without being grounded in truth, okay? So an excerpt from one of the Britannica articles says this. It says, over the following decades, waves of Jewish immigration to Palestine led to a significant increase in the Jewish population. The rapid immigration rate, which was managed by the United Kingdom, was met with protests from the Arab population in 1947, as the United Kingdom prepared to withdraw from the region. The United Nations passed a partition plan known as UN Resolution 181 that would divide Palestine into a Jewish state, blah, 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 blah. We've read that bit before. The partition plan was rejected by the Arabs, and the ensuing conflict over territory led to the First Arab-Israeli War of 1948-49. At the close of the war, the state of Israel had captured additional territory, while Transjordan, which is now Jordan, took control of the West Bank, and Egypt took control of the Gaza Strip. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians either fled or were expelled, most of them becoming stateless refugees, while hundreds of thousands of Jews fled or were expelled from Arab countries and were resettled in Israel. Now, Palestinians, having no government of their own, organized themselves into many separate groups to promote a nationalist struggle. These groups were largely superseded by the establishment of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is the PLO, in 1964, which is an umbrella group promoting Palestinian self-determination. Now, everyone usually points out that the Arabs occupying Palestine were forced out by Israel, but no one ever mentions the ethnic Jews that were forced out of their homes in the neighboring Arab states into Israel. It was never a one-sided affair, and furthermore, a two-state solution was proposed and it was rejected by the Arab side. And I didn't go through all of them in this episode, but there was actually 7 times that a two-state solution has been proposed. Israel has accepted every time, and every single time the Arabs have rejected it. Now, it was the Arab side who attacked, okay? And that history is too often forgotten about. It wasn't the Palestinian people who attacked, it was the surrounding nations. They simply do not want a Jewish presence in the Middle East. So these attacks have nothing to do with the land. It's solely the fact that ethnic Jews live there. Now, we also need to remember who the actual occupiers of the land are as well, because Israel is often called the occupiers. But as we've seen through history, it's always been ethnic Jews who lived in the land. The Arabs are the occupiers since the Islamic wars of this 12th century, who forced Jews out of their homes to occupy the land. Now, the Jews are simply reclaiming what was already theirs, and the Arabs don't like it. They don't want them there, period. And they don't want to live side by side with them, which is evident from the amount of times a two-state solution has been offered and rejected. Now, Israel is very, very happy to live side by side with Arabs, because if you remember, 20% of their population today is Arab, and they all live at peace inside Israel's borders. Now, for all those people calling out apartheid against Israel, which means that they're discriminating and segregating other races, it just couldn't be further from the truth, because the numbers just don't lie. But fast forward a few years, right, to 1956, and we have a new conflict. But this time, neither the Arabs or Israel are to blame. They got dragged into it. But what came out of it was even worse. And I want to make it clear for all of you listening, okay? Finding information on anything to do with Israel and Palestine or the Arab world is severely one-sided. The narrative is severely skewed against Israel, and sometimes it's warranted, but as I found out, sometimes the propaganda just hides the truth. And if you're willing to spend more than 10 minutes looking into it, the truth is often very, very different than what is readily available. Now, sometimes this is why these episodes take so long to get out, okay? Because a 5-minute spoken section can have on its own 3 to 4 hours of research before it can even be written. But anyway, going back. So in 1956, Egypt decided to take control of the Suez Canal under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrowing Britain and France, which granted them complete control of trade in the Middle East. Israel launched an offensive and ended up taking control of Gaza and the Suez Canal, and upon request of the USA and Russia, they withdrew, but not after slaughtering hundreds of Palestinian civilians for no reason. That's what you will find with a 10-minute search on the subject. The search results are overwhelmingly in favor of putting Israel through the mud, and I've linked an article from that point of view in the show notes. If you dig just a little bit deeper, you find out that Israel was actually approached and asked to aid France and Britain in taking back the Suez Canal because losing the ability to trade through it meant that Europe had lost most of its oil supply. So it was in Europe's best interest to regain it back, and they asked Israel for assistance. But Egypt is also not completely at fault here either, because Nasser had been pushed into a corner by broken promises from the West. Now here's an excerpt from an article from Britannica. It says, the Suez crisis was provoked by an American and British decision not to finance Egypt's construction of the Aswan High Dam, as they had promised, in response to Egypt's growing ties with communist Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union. Britain and France feared that Nasser might close the canal and cut off shipments of petroleum flowing from the Persian Gulf to the Western Europe. When diplomatic efforts to settle the crisis failed, Britain and France secretly prepared military action to regain control of the canal and, if possible, to depose Nasser. They found a ready ally in Israel whose hostility towards Egypt had been exacerbated by Nasser's blockage of the Straits of Tiran at the mouth of the Gulf of Aqaba, and the numerous raids by Egyptian-supported commandos into Israel during 1955 to 56. Nasser emerged from the Suez crisis a victor and hero for the cause of Arab and Egyptian nationalism. Israel did not win freedom to use the canal, but it did regain shipping rights in the Straits of Tiran. Britain and France, less fortunate, lost most of their influence in the Middle East as a result of the episode. So, Nasser was put into a corner, but the focus throughout history has always been placed against Israel, painting them out to be barbarians and ruthless. Now, this version of events is also backed up by an American government document that I managed to find as well, which is linked in the show notes. So Israel launches their ground attacks and ends up securing the Suez Canal and Gaza. Great Britain and France, they come in pretending to be the peacemakers, as they had planned, but it backfired on them, and they were found out. And then you have what's known as the Khan Yunis massacre that occurs straight after this, in which Israel is accused of using their newly founded position of power to impose curfews and murder hundreds of Palestinian civilians in their homes. But what's often left unsaid is that Egypt was training militant groups called the Fedayeen, who were themselves actually persecuting many of the Palestinian residents. Now, these militant groups were dressed up in plain clothes, and they were responsible for huge amounts of attacks on Israeli soldiers, on Palestinian civilians, and the Jewish civilians inside Palestine. So, Israel, by gathering intelligence, enforced a curfew, and they went door to door in search of members of these Fedayeen militant groups. Now, I have no doubt that many of the numbers recorded were innocent civilians. This happens in war, but I also believe that a lot of them were members of these Fedayeen groups too. Now, it's often also said that Israel at this time was forcing Palestinians out of their homes and persecuting them with a more formal tag of ethnic cleansing. But this cannot be further from the truth. Jordan was in control of the West Bank at this time, not Israel, and Egypt was in control of Gaza. So here's another excerpt from Britannica. It says during the 20 years of the Gaza Strip was under Egyptian control, 1948 to 67, it remained little more than a reservation. Egyptian rule was generally repressive. Palestinians living in the region were denied citizenship, which rendered them stateless. So it left them basically without citizenship of any country. And they were allowed little real control over local administration. They were, however, allowed to attend Egyptian universities and at times to elect local officials. In another part, it says, through a series of political and social policies, Jordan sought to consolidate its control over the political failure of Palestinians and become their speaker. It provided education and in 1949 extended citizenship to Palestinians. Indeed, a majority of all Palestinians became Jordanian citizens. However, tensions soon developed between original Jordanian citizens and the better educated, more skilled newcomers. Wealthy Palestinians lived in the towns of the eastern and western sides of the Jordan River, competing for positions within the government, while the Fellahin filled the UN refugee camps. Now, the Egyptians didn't want the Palestinians, okay, and the Jordanians treated them like second-class citizens. But through the easy-to-find history of today, Israel gets the blame for it. The propaganda is just insane, guys. It really is. There was no ethnic cleansing from Israel. Okay, Great Britain and France are to blame for the Suez Crisis, not Israel. And the Khan Yunis massacre, as it's called, was not a massacre, but a response to militant groups constantly attacking ethnic Jewish civilians. When Israel was ordered by the USA to leave Gaza and the Suez, they did. And it was returned to Egyptian control, with Great Britain allowed to trade in the region, but have no control over it at all. Now, there is another article which has the version of events from the Israeli point of view, and I want to read a little bit of a snippet. The United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, which is the UNRWA, noted in a December 1956 report that a large number of civilians were killed in Khan Yunis on November the 3rd, but there was conflict in the accounts given as to the causes of the casualties. Israel's army recently told AFP that after the Gaza takeover, about 4,000 Egyptian soldiers and Fedayeen and Palestinian combatants remained inside, with many dressed as civilians. Israeli operations to curb Fedayeen attacks and confiscate weapons sparked clashes, the army said. This led to harm civilians, as the IDF could not differentiate between combatants and uninvolved civilians. Barbak claimed Israel had punished Khan Yunis because of the ferocity of the resistance. The UNRWA also reported that a number of refugees were killed by Israeli fire in Rafah, further south, on November 12th. Israel's army described those kills as 48 rioters who threatened troops, citing the then Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. It seems to be a common theme with the Arab world to hide amongst civilians, okay, while claiming genocide or ethnic cleansing. Now, if you need to pause for a little bit, we'll take a break, go for it, okay? We've gone 44 minutes, and I'm probably not even actually halfway yet. So if you need to take a break, go for it and pause it, because we're about to sort of get into a little bit of a different topic. So anyway, during the same period of time, you have Russia supplying weapons to Syria, and then also to Egypt after funding them in the end to build the dam that the USA, Britain, and France pulled out of, which started that little mini war. So Syria comes to the rescue of Egypt, right? They give them money, they're giving them arms, and then you've got Russia, it's also, which we'll find out in a second, Russia is also supplying Syria with arms as well, and it ends up being this big arms race. And it's all because the USA, Britain, and France pulled out of helping Egypt. If they'd have done that, this whole war would have been avoided. But now you've got really strong nations allied with your enemies, okay? Because Syria is a big nation back then, and Russia as well was a really strong nation. So then we come to the famous Six-Day War of 1967. But here is what led up to it. So Syria and Jordan were increasing their attacks against Israel, and the Soviet Union had given false information to Syria that Israel was planning to attack it. Now, getting sick of the frequent attacks, Israel launched an airstrike on the West Bank and shot down 6 Syrian MiG jet fighters. President Nasser of Egypt threw his support behind Syria. He told the United Nations Emergency Force to leave Sinai, and he closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping, creating a blockade of the east coast of Eilat in the south of Israel. Jordan then signed over its military to Egyptian control, and Iraq came and joined the alliance as well. So once again, the Arab nations around Israel surrounded them, okay, without any previous provocation from Israel. So you've got Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq all pitted against Israel, this tiny little nation that's literally a sliver of land. So what was Israel supposed to do? Just let all these nations come in and wipe them out? Just let all the bombs just keep coming in? Well, no. This is what happened according to Britannica. In the response to the apparent mobilization of its Arab neighbours, early in the morning of June 5th, Israel staged a sudden preemptive air assault that destroyed more than 90% of Egypt's air force on the tarmac. A similar air assault incapacitated the Syrian Air Force. Now, without cover from the air, the Egyptian army was left vulnerable to attack. Within 3 days, the Israelis had achieved an overwhelming victory on the ground, capturing the Gaza Strip and all of the Sinai Peninsula up until the east bank of the Suez Canal. An eastern front was also opened on June 5th when Jordanian forces began shelling West Jerusalem, disregarding Israel's warning to King Husseini to keep Jordan out of the fight, only to face a crushing Israeli counterattack. On June 7, Israeli forces drove Jordanian forces out of East Jerusalem and most of the West Bank. The UN Security Council called for a ceasefire on June 7th that was immediately accepted by Israel and Jordan. Egypt accepted the next day. Syria held out, however, and continued to shell villages in northern Israel. On June the 9th, Israel launched an assault on the fortified Golan Heights, capturing it from Syrian forces after a day of heavy fighting. Syria accepted the ceasefire on the 10th of June. Israel warned Jordan to stay out of the war. That's the thing with Israel. They generally warn first. And we will see that when we get to the most recent wars. Syria, they ignored the ceasefire and kept attacking, yet Israel immediately accepted a ceasefire. They don't want to be fighting, okay? It's not their goal. But the media and the activists of today certainly paint a completely different picture to what's recorded in history. If Israel's goal was to ethnically cleanse the area, it wouldn't have accepted a ceasefire, would it? But 6 days is all it took. June 5 to 10th of 1967. And again, this tiny little country on the defensive prevented themselves from being wiped out by a combined army of many nations. And you're going to keep seeing that. They are always on the defensive or retaliating. There are generally very, very few instances where Israel is the aggressor. So now Israel again has the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and again has gained the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights. The Britannica article continues. It says the Arab countries' losses in the conflict were disastrous. Egypt's casualties numbered more than 11,000, with 6,000 for Jordan and 1,000 for Syria, compared with only 700 for Israel. So that is 18,000 casualties on the countries that attacked them, and Israel only lost 700. The Arab armies also suffered crippling losses of weaponry and equipment. The lopsidedness of the defeat demoralized both the Arab public and the political elite. Nasser announced his resignation on June the 9th, but quickly yielded to mass demonstrations calling for him to remain in office. In Israel, which had proved beyond question that it was the region's preeminent military power, there was euphoria. So now what happens with all the Palestinians who were living in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights? Today's propaganda machine will tell you that Israel continued with ethnic cleansing inside their new borders, but history tells a different story. And keep in mind, a lot of these Palestinians are not just Muslim, okay? There is also a large Christian population there. And the Christian Palestinians make up both Arab Christian and Jewish Christian, okay? So before I quote more from this article, I want to point out something else as a reminder that under Jordanian and Egyptian rule, Gaza and the West Bank were in poverty, okay? They were not accepted by their Arab or their Muslim brothers in Jordan or Egypt. They had no government or aid other than the United Nations. And essentially, they were the baby that was left at a bus stop waiting to be adopted, pretty much. But the aftermath of this six-day war shows just how much better off they were with Israel in control of these areas. So the Britannica article says, Israel's victory gave rise to another exodus of Palestinians in which more than 250,000 people fled to the eastern bank of the Jordan River. However, roughly 600,000 Palestinians remained in the West Bank and 300,000 in the Gaza Strip. Thus, the 3 million Israeli Jews came to rule some 1.2 million Arabs, including the 300,000 that were already living in the state of Israel. Moreover, a movement developed among Israelis who advocated settling the occupied territories, particularly in the West Bank, as part of the Jewish patrimony in the Holy Land. Several thousand Israeli Jews settled in the territories in the decade following the war. Now, many people will focus on the displacement of Palestinians and Israelis settling in the captured areas. They will call Israel occupiers, and I get that, okay? There's no argument for me against it, but isn't that what every country does when they capture land? Okay, so it's okay for the Islamic countries to capture land and settle there, but it's not okay for Israel to do the same thing. It's kind of a hypocritical argument, really. And another thing, Israel didn't even force these Palestinians out. These Palestinians fled from the war that was started by the Arab nations around them, okay? Israel had nothing to do with the reason that they left. So anyway, the article continues. In the years following the 1967 war, circumstances changed dramatically for Palestinian citizens of Israel. As a result of their resumed contact with the Palestinians of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they began to recover from their long period of inactivity. Following the Yom Kippur War of 1973, Palestinians in Israel played a greater role in Israeli institutions. They also were significantly affected by Israel's economic prosperity, and by the 1980s, the economy of Palestinian areas had gained some autonomy as Palestinians moved from unskilled work to business ownership. We will get into the next war in a second, but the Palestinians who were neglected by Nasser of Egypt and Husseini of Jordan, simply because of different tribes or social positioning, were now flourishing and out of poverty, integrating with the people of Israel. Does that sound like a nation that calls for genocide? It really grinds my gears when I hear pro-Palestinians saying that today. It really does. Israel may have been in power over them, but they were certainly not oppressed under Israeli rule. Then comes the Yom Kippur War of 1973, in which Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. It was the 6th of October and it was a Sabbath. Now have a think about that, okay? Knowing that Israel would be in worship on that day and not working, they were attacked. The war was started because Israel had refused to return the land it conquered in the 1967 war, with Egypt's new president, Anwar Sadat, being the aggressor, and for Israel to return their borders to the pre-1967 borders. Since that six-day war, fighting amongst Arab and Israeli forces had gotten stronger and stronger, and it boiled over. Israel's stance was that if their borders of 1967 weren't good enough to prevent being attacked and bring peace in 1967, then why would they be in 1973? And I, for one, would agree, okay, because it's illogical. Think about it. Give us the land back that you conquered and return to your small borders and we'll be peaceful with you. Look, it didn't work before, okay, and you'd be a fool to think that it would work now. So, of course, Israel rejected the terms and the war began. So Egypt and Syria attacked simultaneously. Egypt crossing through the Suez Canal and Syria through the Golan Heights, and it was easier than they thought it would be. Now, Israel's reserve ammunition was quickly dwindling, and they asked the USA for help, but they were denied until the Soviet Union started resupplying the Syrians. Then President Nixon opened an emergency supply line that was met with a great deal of difficulty, with oil embargoes enforced by the Arab nations and the USA allies refusing to assist with arms shipments. Now, the tide started to turn, and Israel managed to cross the Suez and surround the Egyptian third wave, and managed to push back Syria by pushing through the Golan Heights all the way up to Damascus. The UN called for a ceasefire, but the fighting continued for a few more days until Israel signed the ceasefire with Egypt on the 11th of November. But it took Syria until the 31st of May the next year. So again, when it comes to ceasefires, Israel comes to the table first, all the time. The Arab countries evidently use it to continue firing without expecting repercussions. And I'm whizzing through these wars, guys, okay, because there's a lot more information on these wars, but for the sake of time, I'm trying to paraphrase as much as possible. So eventually in 1978, the Camp David Accords were drawn up by Jimmy Carter, and Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in search of peace between the two nations. Egypt and Israel have a permanent peace treaty in place, and Egypt has not sent troops in so far to date. But there are other forms of attack that they have used, which I'll make a little bit of a mention of later. Among the provisions in the agreement also included a plan to establish a self-governing body in Gaza and the West Bank over a period of 5 years, in which at the end the Palestinians would be autonomous. There's quite a few things that started happening from this time, right up until the 1990s. And one of them was the Palestinian Liberation Organization being formed, or PLO for short. And they were formed to create a governing group to represent the Palestinian residents. Now, they had been around since just after the 1967 Six-Day War, but during this time, they got organized. The Soviet Union recognized them as the sole legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people, yet Jordan and Israel both sought alternatives to the group. The PLO sought recognition from the USA as well, but the USA refused to, so long as they continued to promote terrorism and denounce Israel's right to exist. Now, I hope you guys are starting to see the issue here. Not having a Palestinian state is not the issue. The fact that Israel exists and is its own state is the issue. The Islamic nations do not want them in existence. Now, this PLO group is a very dirty group. Their main goals were to unite the various Palestinian groups under one organization, as the name suggests, and the complete elimination of Israel's sovereignty in Palestine and the destruction of the state of Israel. You see, we all think in the West that this is a war for land, but it's just completely wrong. It's a pursuit of the elimination of ethnic Jews and the state of Israel. Are we getting it yet? Especially for any pro-Palestinian supporter who might be listening. The aim is the genocide of Jews. That's what you're supporting when you chant out from the river to the sea. It's not the other way around as you've been led to believe. This history is accurate. All of this is what actually happened and why it happened. This is why this episode is being done, for your benefit to know the truth of it all. Now, the PLO entered into Lebanon after the Jordanian army kicked them out of Jordan and started recruiting the Palestinian refugees who had fled there after the Six-Day War. But anyway, so being that Lebanon itself, the nation, was neutral during the Six-Day War, and at the time, the majority of Lebanon was Maronite Christians in the north and the Druze in the south, who call themselves Muslim. But apparently they're not Muslim enough to be left alone by the PLO and its guerrilla groups, because they were continuously attacking the Druze in the south, while simultaneously bombing Israeli citizens across the border. And so then you have the Lebanon civil war, which got started. So due to the ferocity of the PLO, how much they were persecuting the Lebanese, as well as the frequent killing of Jewish civilians over the border, Israel entered into Lebanon and intervened in the civil war. They were in a no-win situation. Okay, if they did nothing then, the Israeli citizens would vote them out for not protecting the people. But if they joined in, they would be seen as the aggressor. And all the while, the PLO is able to continue its spread of jihad and elimination of the Jews while masquerading as the hero who helped the Palestinians. So Lebanon themselves wanted them out of the country. I think I read somewhere in an article that or saw it on a YouTube video, that Beirut, the capital of Lebanon, that Beirut at the time was actually called the Paris of the Middle East. Like, it was a peaceful nation. Like, everybody lived there. But here's a breakdown from the article that I linked anyway. Because Lebanon wanted them out of the country, Syria sent their own extension military to help Lebanon, but before long, Beirut got destroyed. So anyway, here's the breakdown from the article. It says, in 1969, Yasser Arafat, leader of the Fatah, was named the PLO's chairman. From the late 1960s, the PLO organized and launched guerrilla attacks against Israel from its bases in Jordan, which prompted significant Israeli reprisals and led to instability within Jordan. This in turn brought the PLO into growing conflict with the government of King Husseini of Jordan in 1970. And in 1971, the PLO was forcibly expelled from the country by the Jordanian army. Thereafter, the PLO shifted its bases to Lebanon and continued its attacks on Israel. The PLO's relations with the Lebanese were tumultuous, and the organization soon became embroiled in Lebanon's sectarian disputes and contributed to that country's eventual slide into civil war. During that time, factions within the PLO shifted from attacks on military targets to a strategy of terrorism, a policy the organization fervently denied embracing, and a number of high-profile attacks, including bombings and aircraft hijackings, were staged by PLO operatives against Israeli and Western targets. From 1974, Yasser Arafat advocated an end to the PLO's attacks on targets outside of Israel and sought the world's community's acceptance of the PLO as legitimate representatives of the Palestinian people. In 1974, the Arab heads of state recognized the PLO as the sole legitimate representative of all Palestinians, and the PLO was admitted to full membership of the Arab League in 1976. Yet the PLO was excluded from the negotiations between Egypt and Israel that resulted in 1979 in the Camp David peace treaty that returned the Israeli-occupied Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, but failed to win Israel's agreement to the establishment of a Palestinian state in the occupied territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And rightly so. The PLO had won the world's recognition to represent the Palestinian people, despite its advocacy of jihad, turning vulnerable Palestinian refugees into guerrilla and militia groups, frequently bombing Israel and hijacking Western aircraft, who were not involved in any of it. But Israel is not stupid. They would not give over Gaza and the West Bank. And would you? You have a known enemy now on your northern border in Lebanon, bombing you with no interest in stopping. So why would you give them space in your southern and eastern borders too? Lebanon is not the issue, okay? Even today, the Lebanese people and government were not the issue, but the PLO and its gradual overtaking of the nation it occupies through hundreds of guerrilla groups was and is the problem. It is a common tactic that works extremely well, and we're seeing it unfold in many Western countries today. It's a very slow takeover and a very effective one. And if we don't wake up soon, we will all end up in the same situation here in the West as well. Now, the article continues. Increasing dissatisfaction with Arafat's leadership arose in the PLO after he withdrew from Beirut to Tunisia. And in 1983, Syrian-backed PLO rebels, supported by Syrian troops, forced Arafat's remaining troops out of Lebanon. Arafat retained the support of some Arab leaders and eventually was able to reassert his leadership of the PLO. Now, this is where the well-known group today, Hezbollah, also started to gain traction. They were created to put an end to the PLO, the arming of Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, and also to remove Israel's presence from Lebanon to end the civil war once and for all, and they were backed by Iran. Now, basically, they were a self-proclaimed cleanup crew, and they ended up becoming a political party. Now, this group is quite simply nothing more than a terrorist organization. It's as simple as that, really. And I've linked an article, not from Britannica this time, but detailing Hezbollah. Now, in 1983, they were found by a USA court hearing to be behind the bombing of the US embassy in Beirut, which killed 69 people. In 1984, a car bomb attributed to Hezbollah was set off again at the US embassy in Beirut, killing dozens. In 1989, Hezbollah signed an agreement to end the civil war in Lebanon, put Syria as the guardian over Lebanon, and ordered every militia group except themselves to disarm, basically absorbing every other group into their own group. In 1992, the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires was bombed, which is also attributed to Hezbollah, and Hassan Nasrallah became their leader after Israel assassinated his predecessor. The same year, they participated in national elections for the first time and they won 8 seats. It just goes on, and eventually they become as big as what they are today. Now, here's an excerpt from the article. It says, Hezbollah emerged during Lebanon's 15-year civil war, which broke out in 1975, when long-simmering discontent over the large armed Palestinian presence in the country reached a boiling point. Various Lebanese sectarian communities held different positions on the nature of the Palestinian challenge. Amidst the infighting, Israeli forces invaded southern Lebanon in 1978 and again in 1982 to expel Palestinian guerrilla fighters that used the region as their base to attack Israel. Hezbollah bills itself as a Shiite resistance movement, and it enshrined its ideology in 1985 manifesto that vowed to expel Western powers from Lebanon, called for the destruction of the Israeli state, and pledged allegiance to Iran's supreme leader. It also advocated an Iran-inspired Islamist regime, but emphasized that the Lebanese people should have the freedom of self-determination. Now, did you notice their policies there? Destruction of the Israeli state. This, my friends, is genocide. We've got to move on, but it's constantly the same thing. The Muslims are calling for the genocide of the Jews. It's not the Jews calling for genocide, okay? They're simply defending themselves, and it's being spun to insinuate that they are bent on genocide. And all you pro-Palestinian supporters are just falling for it. The Palestinian people actually want Israel to wipe out these extremist groups. And you'll see that later on, depending on time as well. So, I mean, when you think you're supporting the Palestinian people, you're actually calling for the very thing that they don't want. Lebanon was a beautiful place until the PLO and Hezbollah showed up. Should Israel have intervened? I mean, yes. They were defending themselves and trying to help Lebanon get control of their problem too. Now then, we come to 1987, and an even more well-known group, Hamas, came to be. Now this was at a time known as the First Intifada, or the First Uprising, where the Palestinians in Gaza began pushing against Israel's presence there. Hamas was then formed to take control of these riots and demonstrations and unify the people. And here's a very quick breakdown from the Britannica article. One group, Hamas, an acronym for the Islamic Resistance Movement, challenged the authority of the secular nationalist movement, especially inside Gaza, and sought to take over the leadership of the Intifada. Hamas was an underground offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which had built up a network of religious, educational, and charitable institutions in the occupied territories, in addition to establishing an armed wing known as the Sheikh Izz al-Din al-Qassam Brigades, named for the nationalist leader killed by the British in 1935. Hamas rejected any accommodation with Israel. So when you have people rioting, attacking, and rebelling, what do? You send in troops to control the situation, yeah? Now that's what we do today in the West. We send in riot police, we send in the National Guard, and then the military. It's common practice. And this is exactly what Israel did. Now, by the end of 1990, the Red Cross estimated that 800 Palestinians had died, 200 of which were under 16 years old, and 16,000 Palestinians were in prison. Now, it's very easy to cheat with statistics, okay? Of those 200 who were under 16 years old, how many of them were carrying guns? How many of them held rockets? Those stats are never recorded. Quite funny that, isn't it? Their age is mentioned, but not the context in why they'd been killed. And so this is done intentionally by many groups to sway your focus off of the cause of the conflict and against the people defending themselves. It's now also being led by a group who refuses to recognize Israel or live side by side with them. But not every Palestinian was pro-Intifada or pro-uprising. And the ones who were even suspected of being sympathetic with Israel or working with them were executed by Hamas. Yes, Hamas executed their own civilians just for suspicion. No trial, no evidence, no nothing. All right, they're just a ruthless, evil group. And we'll see that as we go. And if you don't believe this, here is the excerpt from Britannica, remembering this is recorded history. By mid-1990, the International Red Cross estimated that more than 800 Palestinians had been killed by Israeli security forces, more than 200 of whom were under the age of 16. Some 16,000 Palestinians were in prison. By contrast, fewer than 50 Israelis had been killed. Some hundreds of Palestinians in the occupied territories, accused of being collaborators with Israel, were killed by their compatriots. We'll come back to Hamas in a minute. Now, in 2006, we have the Second Lebanese War. Israel had completely withdrawn from Lebanon in May of the year 2000. Since that time, Hezbollah continued to dispute the borders and complain about Lebanese prisoners held in Israel, all of which came about through the first war, the Lebanese Civil War. In 2006, Hezbollah sent a barrage of missiles into northern Israel, which diverted the IDF soldiers and gave Hezbollah the chance to breach Israel's borders, in which they killed a number of Israeli soldiers and captured 2 to use in negotiations for the release of Lebanese prisoners. Israel then sent their own rockets into southern Lebanon and launched a ground attack, hoping to rescue the captured soldiers, but to no avail. A great deal of Arab leaders criticized Hezbollah for starting the attack, which left 1,000 Lebanese dead and around 1 million of them displaced. But Hezbollah's ability to fight the IDF to a standstill won it some praise from a lot of the Arab world. But again, it's another attack on Israel, and they are on the defensive. Israel is never the instigator, at least not so far. Okay, the abducted soldiers' bodies were returned in 2008, a year after the war was officially over. So you have Hezbollah now running Lebanon in the north, backed by Iran and allied by Syria. Then you've got Jordan in the east, now coming up in Gaza in the southwest, Hamas. The only peace agreement is with Egypt on the west. So Israel is literally surrounded by enemies, all with one common goal: to eradicate and ethnically cleanse the land completely of any Jews and the Jewish state. This is a part of their vows. Okay, this is on their websites. Go to Hezbollah's website, go to the PLO's website, go to Hamas's website, go to any of these places' website, and it's on each of their goals. It's their vows, okay? So now we come back to Hamas, and they'd managed through infighting to become the leaders of Palestine. This officially happened in 2007 after they successfully seized control of the Gaza Strip from a rival Palestinian group, the Fatah, and were voted into government. The Palestinian National Authority, PNA, technically runs the government, but in reality, it's Hamas who does. Now, I'm not going to go through that war because time is definitely running thin, but just prior to this war in 2004, Israel made the decision to completely withdraw all Israeli settlements and military from the Gaza Strip, giving it to the PNA, the Palestinian National Authority, and that was done by September 2005. It proved to be difficult because many of the settlers did not want to leave, but a warning was issued by Israel that they would be forcibly removed a couple of days after the deadline. These are Israeli people living inside Gaza who are being displaced. This is not Israel forcing Palestinians out of their homes. Here's what the Britannica article says. It says on August 15th, 2005, when the deadline for evacuation had passed, only about 2/3 of all the settlers had left their homes, and the Israel Defense Force, IDF, notified the remaining settlers that soldiers would begin enforcing the evacuation order 2 days later. Most of the remaining settlers agreed to leave when prompted by the soldiers, but some resisted and were carried away, sometimes screaming. The most dramatic evacuation was in Kfar Darom, where soldiers broke through a barricade in a synagogue and removed some 200 residents despite violent protest. On August 22nd, the IDF reached an agreement with residents of Netzarim, the last of the settlers in the Gaza Strip, whereby they agreed to evacuate after a final prayer service in the local synagogue. In the weeks that followed, Israeli forces demolished residential buildings and dismantled military installations and completed their withdrawal on September the 12th. So the next year is when Hamas became the government for Gaza, and with their intentions towards Israel vocally established previously, Israel, with the help of Egypt, implemented a blockade stopping imports and exports, and free movement between Gaza and Israel. Within 1 year of Israel leaving Gaza completely and Hamas having full control of the area, 2008, Hamas launches rockets into Israel and sends suicide bombers into Israeli towns. 1 year, guys. This has nothing to do with land and everything to do with the existence of Israel. Now, here's a soundbite from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addressing, I think, the UN.
The problem that we have with the Palestinians is the absence of a Palestinian state. And if they were given a Palestinian state, they would stop the efforts to destroy the Jewish state. But the Palestinians were offered a state many times, including in the partition resolution, and they turned it down. They were offered statehood by my predecessors with lavish concessions. They turned it down. Because the Palestinians are not about creating a state, they're about destroying a state. It defies imagination or understanding how intelligent people around the world, including seasoned diplomats, government leaders, and respected journalists, fall for this absurdity. It's so easy to verify. But wait a minute, Mr. Prime Minister, they tell me. Wait a minute. We believe in a two-state solution where the Jewish state of Israel will live side by side in peace with the Palestinian state. There's only one problem with that. The Palestinians, they don't believe in this solution. They never have. In fact, they effectively had a Palestinian state in Gaza. So what did they do with that state? Peace? Coexistence? No. They attacked us time and time again. Totally unprovoked. They fired rockets into our cities. They murdered our children. They turned Gaza into a terror base from which they committed the October 7th massacre. So here's the uncomfortable truth. The persistent Palestinian rejection of a Jewish state in any boundary is what has driven this conflict for over a century. It is still driving it. It's not the absence of a Palestinian state. It's the presence and existence of a Jewish state. And I find it amazing that the foreign chancelleries and the ministries and all those who pontificate about this, and the leaders, how can they not see this basic truth when it is repeated again and again and again ad nauseum?
The genocide is not from Israel. It never has been. But Israel is occupying the land and it won't leave. Really? We've shown the history of the land, that it was always Judea, which is where the word Jew comes from, by the way. And we've shown that even the Quran says that the land belongs to Israel. So that thought or comment is self-defeating. Israel is not occupying the land. It's their land. Both Hezbollah and Hamas state in their goals to rid the land of the State of Israel. But anyway, Israel gives Gaza to Hamas, puts up a wall, and Hamas launches missiles as a thank you. Then we come to 2012. Hamas sends more rockets into Israel, into civilian areas, and then calls it barbaric when Israel responds by leveling the office building of the Hamas Prime Minister, the cabinet headquarters, and underground missile launch sites because some neighboring buildings were destroyed in the process. And then the world focuses on the collateral damage instead of the reason Israel attacked. You see, Hamas are very well known for their underground bases. They pop up under schools, hospitals, and many other civilian areas. They use their own people as shields, the very people that they fought to gain control over. And whilst Israel attacks intentional targets because its focus is to destroy Hamas and not the Palestinian people, Hamas just sends rockets in willy-nilly into Israel. They don't care where they land, just so long as they do land. And for this reason, Israel acquired and deployed what's known as the Iron Dome. Now, before this episode, I envisioned a big dome, okay, in the center of Israel, full of rocket launchers that spin around and they target incoming ordinances. But it's not really as spectacular as that. It's actually a lot simpler. Well, not simpler per se, but it's just not as technical as that. So what the Iron Dome is, it's a series of 10 mobile battery units. Not battery as in an electrical battery, but the military term, meaning a unit of artillery. They're set up in strategic places around Israel, and it covers pretty much all of its airspace. There's 3 components to it. So they have a radar system that detects incoming threats. Then they have a command and control center that calculates the trajectory of those incoming threats. And then they have the rocket launchers on them themselves. Now their purpose is literally to detect incoming missiles, determine where they're going to land, and intercept any rockets that are destined for civilian areas. Now imagine living in a country that has that many rockets fired into it, that it needs a designated defense system to fight against those rockets. Can you think of anywhere else on Earth that needs something like this? So let's talk some numbers. It was deployed on the 7th of April 2011. By November 2012, it intercepted 400 rockets. By October 2014, it had intercepted over 1,200 rockets. Now that's more than one a day. Okay, how many per day have you got in your backyard? Now here's a quote from the Iron Dome link that's in the show notes. It says, in the most recent Hamas attack from October 7th, 2023, Hamas and Islamic Jihad launched more than 5,000 rockets, most at urban centers. Iron Dome intercepted the majority, preventing what could have been mass civilian casualties. Similar success was repeated during Hezbollah's escalations in northern Israel, and most recently during Iran's direct missile campaign. Now it's October 2025 right now, okay? 5,000 rockets equates to 2,500 a year if you're doing the maths, because there's 2 years between 2023 and October now. That averages to 6.8, or let's just say 7 rockets a day. And that is aimed at on civilian areas. So remember, this system only intercepts rockets that are destined for civilian areas. In one 12-day period, Iran sent 150 rockets and 100 drones that were 90% intercepted. 250 ordinances were sent in a 12-day period. But this system is also expensive. Okay, rockets are not free and they're not cheap. And so a new system has been in development that replaces the rockets with a targeted laser, substantially lowering the costs. What previously cost tens of thousands of dollars per interception now costs around $5 to $10. Yes, you heard that right, single-digit dollars. Now, if you want to see it in action, I've linked a YouTube video as well in the show notes. But continuing on with Hamas, you know what? let's skip the next few wars because they're all the same. So there was quite a few wars with Hamas. There's like a 2012 one, a 2018. There's quite a few Hamas wars. So we're going to skip those for time. But basically, it's all the same thing. Hamas attacks, Israel defends, civilians die, Israel is blamed, and that's pretty much the goal of Hamas. So pretty much just turn the world against Israel. And I'm going to go through how they do that. So what they've done, what we read earlier, is they set up many healthcare plans for the Palestinians, right? They've got education with schools and trainings for job entry, and they've set up media as well to keep Palestinians informed of local news. They're in the housing, they're putting displaced Palestinians in homes, and they really sound fantastic on paper, okay? They've got a lot of programs in place for the people, and they sound really good on paper. But what happens when you control all of these things? Okay, so this is, if you think about it, right, I'm going to go off notes, but you think about the 7 Mountain Mandate that we did an episode on a while ago. You control the government, control the media, control the schools, control the workplaces, control the housing. That's 5 points out of the 7. Okay, so then they've got the arts and they've got something else. But that's 5 things that they control out of the 7. That's basically a theocracy, really. Okay? So what happens when you control all these things? We put the same trust in our own governments that they do the right thing by us and don't abuse their power. But this is what Hamas does. Okay, so they build hospitals, they build the healthcare centers, but only on top of areas that are used to send rockets into Israel. That way, when Israel targets one of these launch sites and destroys a hospital, they can spin it around to say that it was an unprovoked attack on a civilian building. And their media, which they control as well, is set up in place to film the attacks and pull on the world's heartstrings. They run the administering of the food and the aid to Palestinian people as well from donations that come from all over the world. And they have also been confirmed to be hoarding it in their underground bunkers and using their starving citizens on camera to appeal for more, so that you send more aid that never reaches the people that you intended to go to. And it's been confirmed that many of these so-called starving people are actually actors. And there's sometimes videos from previous wars and sometimes videos of people that are in an entirely different country. Right? There are countless videos of military personnel in Gaza who are looking at the amount of food sitting in the open waiting to be dispersed, while Hamas claims Israel is blocking food coming in and starving Palestinians. The food's not being blocked. The food is there. It's just not being distributed. It's been left out in the sun to just, oh man, like, imagine if our governments did this, we would have a big uprising. But they can't have an uprising over there because they're not the ones with the guns. The ones with the guns are Hamas, and they fight dirty, man. The media shows only what Hamas wants to be shown. Al Jazeera is in Hamas's pocket. They're basically operated by Hamas. And look, Hamas soldiers have even been caught dressed as Al Jazeera media personnel who hijack and ransack everything that we send to Palestine. Now, how do you defeat an enemy who hides behind civilians, launching missiles from hospitals and schools? If you just let them, nothing ends. Okay, if you bomb those locations, you're a barbarian. And if you put your weapons down, you'll be wiped off the face of the planet in a split second. The only way that this war ends and Gaza can be rebuilt is if Hamas is stopped. It's as simple as that. This is not genocide on Israel's behalf. This is war. And Israel is on the defensive. In war, there will always be casualties. And no one bats an eyelid when the casualty list piles up in wars involving the West. But there seems to be a double standard when it comes to Israel. Now, I'm going to play a couple of sound clips of people in more authoritative positions than me stating basically the same thing.
If 1,000 Israelis are killed, the world will sort of allow Israel to kill 1,000 Hamas. Anything beyond that, not allowed. Again, that's not how the British army operate. That's not how the American army operate. And we've not had in any recent conflicts, I think in any conflict, the American or British armed forces being told to stop defeating a terrorist enemy because civilian casualties are too high. Very different in Fallujah. Very different in Mosul only a few years ago. The ambition with Mosul was to eradicate ISIS. And that was pretty much achieved. But at what death toll? The world didn't care. With Israel, they care obsessively.
You're an idiot if you think that Israel committed genocide in Gaza. The Jewish people are judged by a different standard than the rest of the world. In 1941, Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, killing about 2,000 American sailors. In response, America killed 3.5 million Japanese people in World War II. In 2001, on 9/11, terrorists took down the Twin Towers, killing approximately 3,000 people. In response, America invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, killing about 500,000 people. If Mexico or Canada elected a terrorist organization or a cartel that entered American borders and kidnapped, raped, and killed American citizens, nobody would accuse America of genocide for responding to what they did. But when Israel is attacked and they have to defend themselves, they will never be allowed to finish a war that they never started. There's a standard for the rest of the world, and there's a standard for Israel. It's not realistic, it's not fair, but it's something that we deal with every day.
Now, before I finish with the October 7 war, let's define a few words. Because when it comes to the October 7 attacks, people seem to be under some sort of spell that shields them from reality and logic. And you'll often hear these attacks were in response to Israel's genocide of Palestinian people. Israel is apartheid, and they're occupying the land, a land that is not theirs, and it's only the Zionists that need to be eradicated. So, firstly, what is apartheid? What does it mean? Apartheid is a policy or a segregation on the grounds of race. Now, seeing as 20% of Israel's population is Arab and African, consisting of Muslims, Christians, and atheists, it's impossible to argue that Israel is apartheid. Okay? There are Jews and non-Jews, actually, in their Knesset, in their parliament. There are non-Jewish doctors, lawyers, scientists, chemists, bankers, and even in the military. Yes, even the IDF includes Arabs and Africans, people who intentionally join to protect the nation of Israel. Now, here's another soundbite from somebody who actually worked in the government, and her name is Natasha Horsdorf, okay, if anyone's interested.
When I worked in the Supreme Court in Jerusalem, I worked under an Arab justice. There are currently Arab members of parliament sitting in Israel's Knesset. There are Arab doctors. There are Arab lawyers. There are Arab army officers who are, as we speak, defending the people of Israel against this heinous, barbaric terrorism.
That's hardly segregation based on race, is it? Now let's look at occupation. To occupy the land means you are living in a land that is not yours. And I think we've already shown that to be incorrect through the first part of the show. But you Americans, does the land belong to you or to the Indians who were there before you? Australians, is the land ours or did it belong to the Aboriginals that were here before us? The difference with the Jewish people is the land was originally theirs and the Arabs are the occupiers. So let's look at the word Zionist. What is the definition of a Zionist? Any person who supports the self-determination and statehood of the Jewish nation in their historical homeland, the land of Israel. And that's a bad thing. Why? Why is the word Zionist used as a type of insult? Why is Zionism a bad thing? It's because the people against Zionism do not want any ethnic Jew in the land of Israel or the state of Israel to exist. And that's literally what a Zionist is. It's just somebody who thinks that the land should exist, that they have a right to live there. So if you're anti-Zionist, then you're actually the one who's in the wrong. Do you understand? If you're against Israel having their own land and living in it, you're going against the word of God if you call yourself a Christian, and you're going against the Quran if you call yourself a Muslim, and you're going against historical fact and evidence if you're an atheist. There's nowhere that you can have a case. And then lastly, let's look at the word genocide, shall we? What does genocide actually mean? Genocide means the intentional destruction of any ethnic, racial, national, or religious group. So that's the meaning of genocide. So what was Hezbollah and Hamas's goals again? What did they vow? to eradicate the state of Israel. Case in point. So let's go to October 7, 2023, and let's look at what took place. Hamas entered into Israel en masse and murdered families. They beheaded pregnant mothers and cut babies from their wombs and beheaded them also. They walked the streets shooting and hacking any Jew that they could find, recording it on film and celebrating it. They opened fire on a music festival full of teenagers and nearly murdered all of them. They abducted hundreds of prisoners and took them back into Gaza, where they continued to rape, beat, and murder them. They sent a barrage of mortars and rockets into Israel's borders, firing at random into civilian areas while the Iron Dome was down. They were indiscriminate. They did not target the military specifically, nor take aim at any particular political or military site. They literally just searched and destroyed civilians walking the streets of Israel. And these are the people that pro-Palestinian rallies in the West are supporting. It makes me sick. They then went back into Gaza, underground, and used their own people as shields while Israel launched their own offensive in defense, trying to get their abducted citizens back home. They hid beneath schools and hospitals, launching their attacks from those locations. They even blew up their own hospital with a failed rocket, or their own school, and tried blaming it on Israel. And they were holding their own Palestinian citizens captive there when Israel launched their own rockets back. And you know what? Israel actually sent out flyers from the air. And they sent out warnings via a text message system to mobile phones, warning the Palestinians to evacuate the area days before they launched their counterstrikes. Israel did its utmost to minimize civilian casualties, while Hamas used them as shields, trying to maximize the numbers for media sympathy from the West, and the West fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. They dress in media vests as well, posing as members of the press, so that when they're killed, it looks like Israel has intentionally murdered the press. There's plenty of videos on that. The most famous is of a Hamas operative who was killed, whose name is Saleh al-Jafarawi, who was an actor seen in videos as a doctor, as a member of the press, an injured victim, and also standing alongside Hamas leaders and celebrating on video when the October 7 massacre was on, whilst it was happening, and then a few days later crying on video as well when Israel launched their attacks back. He's being portrayed as a member of the press, which he certainly was not. I mean, dressing as a cop doesn't make you a cop, yeah? And what's interesting about it is that he wasn't killed in a skirmish with the IDF. Okay, it was a skirmish with a rival group inside of Gaza after the ceasefire was in place, where Hamas was lining up and executing rival groups. And this is another tactic that Hamas uses. So when Hamas found that Israel's soldiers were going door to door looking for them in the streets of Gaza, they forcibly removed Palestinians from their homes and they booby-trapped the houses for maximum destruction. So when the Israelis go in there and they open up, the houses blow up, right? And you get this destruction of houses. But what Israel does is it sends out warnings to people living in Gaza of when and where they will attack, giving them plenty of time to evacuate it. But then Hamas makes sure that those areas are filled with civilians. So tell me, who's responsible for the genocide? Okay, and even more, all of this is recorded and verified with all the links in the show notes. There's no conspiracy theories here, and it's not just me running my mouth. Now, this guy, Saleh al-Jafari, or Jafari, whatever his name is, he's also known as Mr. FAFO, which is the F around and find out. If you Google that guy, you're going to see him pop up everywhere. Okay, and you're going to see him portrayed as a Hamas supporting influencer. That's how they've portrayed him, but he's not. He was a terrorist. He was an actor. But anyway, so a ceasefire was brokered through Donald Trump for October 10th, 2025. So not that long ago, just a couple of weeks ago. And that's 2 years after this conflict has started. And part of the agreement was that Israel's hostages would be released, and Israel was to release Palestinian prisoners. And these are convicted prisoners. So essentially, Hamas returns innocent civilians, and Israel hands over convicted rapists, murderers, and terrorists. Right? People have gone through the judicial system, not prisoners of war, but actual convicted criminals. Like, can you not see Israel's heart in this compared to Hamas's heart? Hamas, oh yeah, we'll just give you your innocent civilians back, but we want terrorists back in our country. Like, we want you to send us our terrorists back. Like, can you not see the heart of these two groups here? Okay? And this is not me trying to make a point for Israel or make a case for Israel or try and get your heartstrings towards Israel. This is verifiable. Every single one of the links in the show notes will verify everything that I say in this. Like, this is truth. This is not propaganda. There's a complete list of all the people that were released in the show notes. Names, numbers, whether they were alive, dead, the dates, all of that. I've linked one of those. But not even a few days into the ceasefire, Hamas deployed armed fighters and police around Gaza, and they rounded up groups of people who they claimed were collaborators and local gang members, and they slaughtered them on TV. It was on the local news here, and trying to find information on it was really, really hard, but there is a link in the show notes. They also broke the terms of the ceasefire agreement by not delivering every deceased hostage back to Israel by the deadline. Then they staged the recovery of the remains of a hostage for the media, and then they attacked Israeli soldiers who were doing a routine patrol, which they denied, but the media made sure that they caught Israel's retaliation, and they portrayed Israel as the ones who broke the ceasefire. It's no wonder that there are still pro-Palestinian rallies in various parts of the Western world, because the media continues to portray them as the victim, right? So they're making the victim the aggressor and the aggressor the victim. Our moral compass is so far from north, it's not funny anymore, man. And to date, right, what's the date today? 30th of October that I'm recording this. Hamas has still not returned the bodies of all the Israel hostages, which was a condition of the ceasefire. I mean, come on, man. Like, I really hope that you can see that Israel is not the aggressor here. Okay, there are multitudes of conspiracy theories around them that literally are disproven through history. This is not a war for land rights. This is not a religious war, and it's not a fight against Israel committing genocide. This is a genocidal group, or actually groups, because we now have Hezbollah, Hamas, and even the Houthis of Yemen, and we've got Iran as well, all attacking Israel simply for existing. I hope this episode has shed some light on the truth of the situation for a lot of people who listened. And there is tons that we didn't even get into, like the tunnels from Lebanon into Israel, which were dug out by Hezbollah to launch ground attacks on Israel. The tunnels that were built from Gaza to Egypt, bypassing the blockade that Egypt installed after the peace treaty with Israel, for Hamas to get arms supplies from terror groups inside of Egypt. Like, we didn't get into any of that. But it shows the lengths that these groups go to try and eradicate Israel. And while we didn't directly mention it, Hamas is not Palestine, okay? And Palestinians are not Hamas. What happens from Gaza is not coming from the residents of Gaza, okay? It's coming from a terror group holding the Gazans captive. So please don't by any means look down on the Palestinian people. It's not Palestinians that are the problem. It's the leaders or the group that's assumed control over them. All right? Because many of them are actually Christian. A lot of these Palestinian people are Christian. And they aren't all, and the ones that aren't, they aren't even all Muslim or secular. The Muslim population itself of these Palestinian people is not all jihadis either. So please just don't condemn the people for the actions of the leadership. At the end of the day, the land itself was always Israel's. History confirms it, the Bible confirms it, and the Quran confirms it. So there should be no group at all disputing it. The Arab people who came in the 7th century and the 12th century are the occupiers. The Palestinian people themselves are victims suffering from the hands of their own government, not from Israel's hands. And the only genocide going on is from these groups fighting against Israel, trying to exterminate them. But God is with them. they will never be eradicated because their future is in the Word of God. They have a prophetic future. And we need to pray for all of these terror groups that Jesus reveals himself to them. And Hamas is destroyed, not through war, but through coming to know the Lord Jesus Christ as the Son of God and the Savior of the world. Now, God bless you guys and girls. Thank you for sitting through that. I know it was long, and I appreciate your patience. I'll see you on the next episode, God willing. Peace.